Martin Luther King Jr. once wrote, "Why is equality so assiduously avoided? Why does white America delude itself? And how does it rationalize the evil it retains?" This statement was originally intended to speak on injustice within the black community, but it can be similarly related to the injustice immigrants face today under Trump's immigration policy. As discussed in New York Times editorial, Donald Trump isn't making the country safer, where it explores the effects of Donald Trump's immigration policy. While the information is adequate, it lacks proper supporting examples to tie its point back to its main claim. So today I will discuss first the lack of white supremacy domestic terrorism examples that they speak of happening more frequently. Second, the funds that are being redirected from FEMA and where they are going to, what they were being wasted on, and how much it was. And last, the vague description of Homeland Security being unstable. Although true, the argument lacks depth. So to begin, current immigration policies have caused a rise in domestic violence cases. The New York Times argues that the number of domestic terrorism acts are fueled by this toxic ideology, being white nationalism. This claim provides a direct indicator that the administration's toxic ideology is causing a rise in more racially charged domestic terrorism cases. Although the acting Secretary of Homeland Security affirmed that there has been a rise in the number of domestic terrorism acts, the editorial provides no statistical evidence supporting the statement, which may have strengthened their argument. Further, expert testimony from FBI Director Christopher Wray said that as the start of the fiscal year in October, they've made over 100 arrests related to domestic terrorism, which all can be seen as some type of white supremacist crime. The fact is the only support used to show the rise in domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism has rapidly increased within the past 10 years, but more so within the past 3 during Trump's presidency. For example, a deadly attack in Charlottesville, Virginia, where one woman was killed and 19 others were severely injured, which brought attention to far-right terrorism. Further, the 22 innocents murdered in El Paso joined too many other victims of this terrorist ideology. 11 people were killed at a Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, 9 worshipers were murdered at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, and all but one of the U.S. terror victims last year were killed by white nationalists. However, the White House finds discomfort in discussing this, saying because the preponderance of it involves white supremacy, and that's not something this administration is comfortable speaking out against. To continue, funds being improperly used to up the budget for the border and detention facilities. The New York Times argues that the president's obsession with what he has termed an immigrant invasion is already undermining the functioning of his administration, implying that the services have been cut to provide more funding for those future detention services. The New York Times article targets dialogue towards specific changes in policies that the administration made that the average citizen may not be aware of. For example, in the beginning of 2019, the government had the longest shutdown in history, where Congress offered $1.375 billion to start the border wall Donald Trump had been asking for. This $1.375 billion was pulled from the Treasury Department's Drug Forfeiture Fund, Department of Defense's Drug Interdiction Program, and the Department of Defense's Military Construction Account. If that money was not enough, we still have to fund, on average, the $134 a day it is to maintain one adult detention bed, the $319 a day it costs to maintain a family bed, and the $775 per person per night it costs for tent cities when children are separated from their families. There are still other basic ideas of protection the country risks losing, with all the attention being put on finances and putting the funds in other places that they don't necessarily need to be put. Does this confirm that the Trump administration is removing services and funds to make room for detention services? Yes, in fact, according to the New York Times editorial, Donald Trump isn't making the country safer. The administration diverted nearly $10 million from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is still planning on pulling $155 million specifically from the agency's disaster relief fund this year. Furthermore, the last point made regarding the safety of the country discusses Homeland Security and their relationship with the business, as well as with Donald Trump himself. In June, the president voiced hesitation about permanently nominating their current Secretary of Homeland Security, saying he still needed to get used to him. This statement was pulled directly from the editorial. However, it lacks any evidence to support that the staff of Homeland Security is making the country any less safe. The hiring and firing of members of one staff does not immediately mean the equivalent to poor nationwide security. According to the editorial, several officials, including former Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, have been pushed out in recent months, but now have these officials directly affected the nation's safety. There are no adequate examples of any cause and effect regarding Homeland Security. Although Homeland Security does factor into the level of safety and urgency our nation may or may not have, the examples given within the editorial fail to tell us how the chosen staff has failed in that sense. The number of immigrants being put into harm's way has skyrocketed since this administration. For example, the Department of Homeland Security is directed to begin the process of hiring over 10,000 immigration and customs agents, expanding the number of detention facilities, and creating an office within Immigration and Customs Enforcement to help families of those killed by undocumented immigrants. Further, through public records requests of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we obtained data on 1,199,026 ICE encounters, 381,370 arrests, and 650,944 removals that occurred between January 2016 and September 2018. In conclusion, as we have seen, the problem isn't immigrants or citizens. It is Trump administration's blatant racism and discrimination imposed on immigrants, which ultimately have led to a rise in white supremacist domestic violence and terrorism, lack of funds, and the extension of unnecessary immigration policies. To repeat what the editorial once said, a responsible leader must think less about his personal prerogatives and more about the nation's overall security.